If you woke up tomorrow and every dollar you had still existed, but meant something completely different, would you even notice? Not because your balance changed, not because your bank app broke, but because the rules behind money itself had quietly been rewritten. No announcement, no sirens, no emergency broadcast, just a slow technical adjustment, buried in policy, signed in offices, explained with calm language, that permanently changed what your money actually is. Most people believe money collapses with a bang. Hyperinflation, bank runs, riots, empty ATMs. That's the movie version. That's the dramatic version. But historically, the most powerful monetary transformations did not look like collapse. They looked like upgrades, modernization, efficiency, stability reforms, and the public often welcomed them. There was a moment in modern history, one specific turning point, when money stopped being anchored to reality and became something else entirely. Not fake, but not solid. Not backed, but declared. Not constrained, but expandable. And almost nobody understood what had just happened. To understand how control over money changed, and why ownership feels weaker today, scarce, difficult to create. Gold and silver weren't chosen because they were shiny. They were chosen because they were resistant to manipulation. You couldn't print them. You couldn't vote them into existence. You couldn't generate them with a keyboard. That limitation was the point. Kings hated that limitation. Governments hated that limitation. War planners hated that limitation. Because physical money imposes discipline, it says you can only spend what exists. And governments, especially during wars and crises, rarely want discipline. So the first step in transforming money was not destroying gold. It was replacing it, gradually, with something more convenient. Paper promises. At first, paper money was simply a receipt, a claim check, a warehouse note that said, this paper can be exchanged for real metal stored somewhere safe. People trusted it because they believed redemption was always possible. You didn't hold paper because paper had value. You held paper because paper represented value. That distinction is everything. Banks issued notes redeemable for gold and silver. Early central banks were created to coordinate the system and prevent chaos. And for a while, it worked. Not perfectly, but predictably. Money supply could only grow as fast as metal reserves grew. Then came the stress tests, wars, depressions, panics. Every major war in the last few centuries created the same financial problem. Governments needed to spend more than they possessed. Tax collection wasn't fast enough. Borrowing wasn't large enough. Gold reserves weren't deep enough. So redemption rules were temporarily suspended, temporarily became repeatedly became normalized. During crises, governments would say, redemption is paused, but only for now, for stability, for national survival, for security. Citizens were told sacrifice was patriotic, and most complied. After the crisis passed, some convertibility returned, but never quite the same as before. Each cycle reduced the connection between paper and metal a little more. This wasn't a conspiracy, it was a pattern. Control follows flexibility. Flexibility requires detachment. Detachment requires abstraction. The more abstract money becomes, the easier it is to expand, the easier it is to redirect, the easier it is to manage populations through it. By the early 20th century, many countries were technically on gold standards, but operationally stretching the rules. Credit creation expanded faster than reserves. Paper claims exceeded metal backing. Confidence replaced constraint. And confidence is powerful, until it isn't. Then came the Great Depression, one of the most important monetary turning points in modern history. Banks were failing. Depositors were panicking. People rushed to withdraw gold. Governments faced a choice. Let the system reset or change the rules. They changed the rules. Gold ownership was restricted. Redemption was halted. Citizens were ordered to turn in their gold in exchange for paper currency. The justification was stability, emergency powers, system preservation. Think about the psychological shift that required. Money went from something you could hold to something you were told to trust. And once the public accepted that shift, even reluctantly, a new era began. From that moment forward, money became increasingly defined by policy rather than by substance. Value came less from what backed currency, and more from who declared it valid. That is the silent turning point most people never study. Because when money stops being anchored, it doesn't just change economics, it changes power. After that first break between money and metal, something subtle but irreversible began to happen. Governments discovered that once redemption is removed, constraint disappears. And when constraint disappears, expansion becomes tempting. Because when money is tied to something scarce, spending has limits. When money is tied to policy, spending has permission. Throughout the 20th century, most major economies tried to maintain at least the appearance of discipline through what became known as the gold exchange standard. Currencies were linked to the US dollar, and the dollar was linked to gold. This system was formalized after World War II under the Bretton Woods Agreement in 1944. On paper, it looked stable. The dollar was pegged to gold at $35 per ounce. Other currencies were pegged to the dollar. Governments could settle imbalances through gold transfers. It created order after the chaos of depression and war, but built inside the system was a tension few people understood at the time. The United States could issue dollars, but it could not easily increase gold reserves at the same pace. As global trade expanded, more and more dollars circulated outside the U.S. than there was gold to redeem them. Foreign governments slowly realized this imbalance. By the 1960s, cracks were visible. France, under President Charles de Gaulle, openly criticized the arrangement and began demanding gold in exchange for dollars. Other countries quietly followed. Gold started leaving U.S. reserves. Confidence began to wobble. Now imagine the decision point. If redemption continued, U.S. gold reserves would be drained. If redemption stopped, the dollar would change nature entirely. On August 15, 1971, President Richard Nixon made the decision. In a televised address, he announced the suspension of dollar convertibility into gold. It was presented as a temporary measure to defend the dollar against speculators. Temporary. That word appears again and again in monetary history. Convertibility never returned. That night, and without riots, without bank runs, without public panic, the global monetary system crossed a line it had never crossed before. For the first time in modern history, the world's reserve currency was backed by nothing physical at all. Money did not disappear. Prices did not instantly explode. Life did not visibly change the next morning. Paychecks cleared, stores opened, markets traded, which is exactly why most people didn't notice. But from that point on, money was no longer a claim on something scarce. It became a unit defined by decree, what economists call fiat currency. Money because authority says it is money. That shift unlocked a new scale of monetary expansion. In the decade after 1971, inflation surged across much of the world. In the United States, the 1970s became known as the Great Inflation. Prices rose rapidly. Savings lost purchasing power. Interest rates eventually had to be pushed into the double digits under Federal Reserve Chairman Paul Volcker to contain the damage. People often blame inflation on greed, corporations, or shortages. But structurally, inflation becomes far easier once money is unconstrained by redemption, because supply is no longer limited by nature, only by policy, and policy responds to pressure. War pressure, recession pressure, political pressure, market pressure, voter pressure. Every crisis becomes a justification for monetary expansion. Every downturn becomes a reason to inject liquidity. Every market fall becomes a signal to support asset prices. Over time, intervention stops being exceptional and becomes expected. Look at the pattern of the last few decades. After the 1987 market crash, intervention increased. After the 2000 dot-com collapse, rates were slashed. After the 2008 financial crisis, quantitative easing began at historic scale. After the 2020 pandemic shock, trillions were created and deployed in months. Each time the tools grew larger, the response grew faster, the scale grew wider. And each time, the justification sounded reasonable. Stabilization, employment, recovery, confidence. But step back and look at the structural direction. When money stopped being anchored, it became adjustable. When it became adjustable, it became a policy instrument. When it became a policy instrument, it became a control surface. Not because of evil intent, but because of system capability. Capabilities get used. There is another historical pattern people miss. When money becomes more abstract, asset prices become more important than wages. Because newly created money enters the system through financial channels first. Banks, markets, government spending, not evenly across households. This is why, after major monetary expansions, you often see asset booms before wage growth. Stocks rise, real estate rises, financial assets inflate. Those who own assets benefit first. Those who live on wages feel the effect later, through rising prices. This pattern showed up after 2008. It showed up again after 2020. It is not random. It is structural. Once money is no longer real in the physical sense, its distribution path shapes inequality patterns. And this leads to the next transformation, the one happening now. When money becomes fully digital and fully abstract, the final step becomes possible. If money is already detached from physical backing, and already adjustable by policy, and already distributed digitally, then embedding rules directly into it becomes technically trivial. Programmability is not a separate revolution. It is the logical continuation of abstraction. First, money stopped being metal, then it stopped being redeemable, then it stopped being scarce. Now it is on the verge of stopping being neutral. That is the progression most people never see, because each step felt normal when it happened. And once money stops being neutral, everything built on top of it changes, because neutral money is silent. It doesn't ask questions. It doesn't judge intent. It doesn't evaluate behavior. It simply moves when directed by its holder. Programmable money is different. It evaluates, it checks conditions, it follows rules before it moves. That may sound like a small technical difference. Historically, it is a civilizational difference. Throughout history, the people who preserved autonomy during unstable periods had one critical advantage. They could transact outside the failing rule system. They could switch mediums, switch networks, switch stores of value. They could step sideways when the main channel broke. Merchants in ancient trade networks settled in different metals when one kingdom debased its coinage. Families in hyperinflationary economies shifted to foreign currency or barter. Citizens under capital controls moved value through goods, commodities, and informal exchange systems. Flexibility was survival. Now imagine a monetary system where flexibility is engineered out, not by law alone, but by infrastructure, where every unit of currency is born inside a rule set, where every transaction passes through automated compliance gates, where deviation is not punished after the fact, but prevented before it happens. Prevention is more powerful than punishment, because punishment creates resistance. Prevention creates resignation. You are less likely to fight a system that doesn't let you act than a system that lets you act and then penalizes you. One feels like a wall, the other feels like a battlefield. Walls are psychologically more effective. We've already seen early forms of transaction-level control in the private sector. Payment processors decline categories of purchases. Platforms ban certain transfers. Banks close accounts based on algorithmic risk flags. Most people accept this because it's fragmented. Different companies, different rules, different appeals. But when the monetary base layer itself becomes rule-driven, fragmentation disappears. One system, one rule engine, one permission layer. Historically, whenever control unified at the base layer, whether in currency, communication, or identity, power concentration accelerated. Think about communication. When printing was decentralized, censorship was hard. When broadcast networks centralized, message control increased. When the internet decentralized again, control weakened, until platforms re-centralized distribution. The same cycle repeats. Decentralize, consolidate, control. Money is following the same arc. Metal was decentralized by nature. Paper was centralized by issuers. Digital is centralized by networks. Programmable is centralized by code owners. And code owners are always closer to power than users are. None of this requires a villain. It only requires incentives. Governments want compliance efficiency. Central banks want policy precision. Regulators want enforcement automation. Institutions want risk reduction. Programmable money offers all four. That is why its development is inevitable, not because of conspiracy, but because of alignment of incentives across powerful actors. The real question is not whether programmable money arrives. The real question is whether citizens understand what changes when it does. When money stopped being metal, discipline weakened. When money stopped being redeemable, expansion accelerated. When money stopped being scarce, inequality patterns shifted. When money stops being neutral, behavior becomes governable. That is the full arc. And the most important lesson from monetary history is this: the public rarely recognizes the turning point while it's happening. Only later, years later, does it become obvious which rule change altered everything. The people who adapt early are not the people who panic. They are the people who study structure. They watch incentives. They follow system design, not headlines. Because headlines report events. Structure predicts direction. If you've stayed with this all the way through, you're clearly not here for noise. You're here to understand how financial systems actually evolve under the surface. That's exactly what this channel is built for. Mapping monetary power, historical turning points, and system mechanics in a way most outlets never explain. If that kind of clarity is valuable to you, subscribe. And stay ahead of the structural shifts instead of reacting to them after the fact.